there was something that someone said to me about parenting that stuck with me and taught me a lesson about working through divorce. And the lesson was, when you raise a child, you also reparent yourself. So you consider how you were raised and make decisions about how you will raise your kid and choose to do things differently to perhaps how you were raised. And I remember thinking about this a lot when my son was very small, and as he was getting older, the lessons I would teach him, the things that I would do, the way that I would deal with certain situations were, actively decisions. I was making decisions that were actively different to how I was raised, and that was the act of reparenting, I guess, myself, and that always stuck with me. And a similar thing happens when you go through a divorce or a massive life change. And I realized this a little late, actually, and I think it was something that I wish someone had told me in the beginning. And the fact is that when you are going through a tough process, like a divorce, when there's a family separation, when you're moving into different houses, when you are having conversations with your ex, that your kid is watching you the whole time, right? You're under observation. They are looking at you, and not necessarily they're not scrutinizing. They're really observing, and this is becoming their frame of reference for how they may potentially deal with a similar situation in the future. So it reminds me of situations in my life where all I've got as a reference point is how my parents dealt with it, and I always think about that in the same way with my son. So he's going to look at how I dealt with the situation of the divorce and the family separation. He's going to look at that and have that as a reference point for him in his life. And I think the biggest realization for me is that in all of this, I want him to have a good, solid, strong, foundational reference point, right? I don't want him to have a reference point that has things like parents arguing, calling each other names, saying nasty things about each other. Because I wouldn't want him to be doing that in front of his own kids if one day he is in a similar situation and lands up in going through a similar process. I mean, I wouldn't wish that on anybody, but it's one has to be realistic. And so the whole time this is happening, in every single thing I do, I always want to do it in a way where I can stand in front of my boy and tell him I did my best, I acted respectfully, I did it in a way that I would was objective and directed, and I would do it again. I would do it again in a heartbeat. So with that framing in mind, it becomes less about whether you win or whether you lose, and whether it's a victory or someone else has taken a defeat. It's not actually about that, because in all of it, the whole purpose of going through these kinds of things is to find a way to resolve this new change and focus it on what's best for him and what's best for the kids, right? That's where it's got to end up. So it was one of the biggest realizations that they're always watching. My kid is always watching, and I want to set an example for him. It's not a pretty situation. It isn't something that is easy to do. It isn't something that is gonna it's not a simple situation to walk a person through. But how many reference points do we have? And if you think back to your childhood, did you have the first clue about how a process like this would kick off? I didn't. I had no idea. I had literally no idea. I think it's a shame, because a lot of people go through this, and there should be community information we can pull from and community experience that we can lean on that helps us get through this kind of stuff. But instead, you're flung into the throes of a very messy situation. Your friends start disappearing. Your life is now completely, the framing of your life is completely changed. And sometimes it can feel like you're drowning, and that's certainly what it felt like for me. So I wish I'd had a good, strong, rooted reference point, right? So I think about that as being something that I can lay a foundation of good for my son. Like, there has got to be good that comes out of these things. And I believe that there always is. I believe it. And I hold on to it, that there will be some good that comes out of all of this. And I believe that good can come out of any bad situation. You just have to look for it. So the thing that this then means in practicality is that I make a very strong point about not throwing insults or saying bad things or casting aspersions, because at the end of the day, talking about someone's parent in a demeaning way is still being disrespectful to that person, right? So why should, for example, my son why should he be on the receiving end of aspersions being cast in that way? Like, it's not right. Like, I should respect his parents, just like anyone should respect my parents, and I won't allow people to say mean things or horrible things about my parents. Like, why should anybody allow that? And so that's really important. And the other thing is to set an example, set a model for how people should resolve issues when there's conflict. Like, at the bare minimum, two adults that are trying to figure out this new life situation need to demonstrate that they've set the direction in line with what's best for the child, right? That's the goal. It isn't about exacting revenge. It isn't about finding some way to satisfy a vendetta. And it certainly isn't about standing up and cheering when there's been a victory at someone else's loss or expense, or like that's not healthy. And that certainly isn't like framing the exercise as being what's beneficial for the kids, right? These things are tough, and they're not easy to solve. They're difficult to navigate. So why make it any harder by turning it into a personal fight or a vendetta or a victory when someone else is burnt to cinders? So that's not the way this should roll, and it's certainly not the way to demonstrate how a conflict should be resolved when adults are involved. If we as adults aren't resolving conflict in an objective and clear and fair way, how will our kids ever learn to do the same? And that's what I think about all the time. I want my son to see that at the very least, if none of this works out the way I'd hoped, if none of this ends up in an equal situation, that at least he's got a reference point for how you should try and attempt to get to that. To get to that. At least he's got something he can look back on and go, well, I understand what to model my behavior on. I understand how to hold respect for someone else while still trying to work out and resolve issues. And I understand how to protect my child from being wrapped up and caught up in all of these difficult situations. That's it.